Today we've got Sue Currell from the University of Sussex, a reader in American literature, who back in the sands of time was once a research fellow here and then moved to Sussex, where she's been climbing the ladder steadily since. She's also the Supreme Commander of the British Association of American Studies, a position in which she wields enormous influence and power, so tread carefully. Yeah. Sue's works on lots of different areas and topics. Her two books published to date are firstly The March of Spare Time, The Problem and Promise of Leisure in America during the 1930s, which came out at the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2003, and second, American Culture in the 1920s, which came out with Edinburgh in 2009. She's also published in journals such as Modern Drama, Modernist Culture. Her present research that she's talking about today is on the relationship of the arts with political discourse during interwar America, in particular as it relates to the journal New Masses, which is what she's going to talk about today. She's going to talk about 35-40 minutes, and then our very own Christopher Phelps is going to offer some thoughts and questions and dialogue with her a little bit about the content of the talk. Christopher obviously needs no introduction, but I'll introduce him anyway. Familiar to many of you, he's an Associate Professor of Intellectual and Cultural History, the author of The Young Sidney Hook, Marxist and Pragmatist, which came out at Cornell in 1997. Published essays and articles and commentaries and thought pieces in places like the Journal of American History, Labour History, Labour, outlets such as Dissent, The Nation, Times Higher Education, Chronicle of Higher Education. I could go on. He's presently working on many books actually, but the two kind of nearest completion I think are A History of the American Left since 1945, which will be forthcoming in the not too distant future, co-authored with Howard Brick, and A History of the Strike in American Political Thought. So I say Sue will talk about 35 to 40 minutes, Christopher will respond, and then you can all ask a question each, and we'll wrap up about midnight. The title of Sue's talk is Women in Overalls, Gender Politics and American Magazine Culture. So,
thank you. Thanks, Bevan. That's a kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here and wonderful to see so many people here interested, presumably in American studies or women's studies or magazine studies. Or all of those things, so hopefully there's something for everyone here, but I think it's testament to the strength of our discipline that there's so many people here, so welcome. So I just want to say a little bit about New Masses magazine, because I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with it. So before I kind of go into a little bit more detail, I just wanted to give you a little brief history of the magazine. The project that I'm working on was funded by the Leverhulme. And the proposal was that I would write a history of this magazine. As I've gone along, I've realised that this is an almost impossible task, and the reasons for that I think may come out in the talk. It's a very it had a very long lifespan. It grew out of a magazine that came before it called The Masses. It ran from 1926 to 48, where it was effectively shut down by HUAC, if you like, by investigations into un-American activities. It became a monthly up to 1956, when it merged with Mainstream, so it became Masses and Mainstream. What's interesting about it, and partly why it's impossible to kind of work on this, is one, it was run cooperatively by a group of editors. It moved around a lot in terms of its editorship, and then it turned from a monthly to a weekly at the height of the Great Depression, 1933. So it becomes a weekly. It had very erratic but impressive circulation figures that at their height actually rivaled those of Vanity Fair, The New Yorker, Esquire and American Mercury. So for a little magazine, because it's an arts and culture magazine, so many of you will be familiar with the kind of literary scene at the time of the little magazine, it actually is kind of, I've called it a big little magazine, if you like, because it has a very wide mass appeal. It was also cheaply produced, selling at 25 cents an issue, or as a monthly, $2 per annum, and it was widely circulated. So the magazine aimed at a broad readership, working and middle class, so there's no, in terms of today's talk, there was no sense of it being a women's magazine or something that was focused on women's issues at all. And it engaged with both the high arts and popular arts, with the key goal of promoting a kind of Marxist criticism of mass culture, if you like, and making political interventions at the time in the US. As this photo by Ben Shans shows, and I think this is just a fantastic photo, I can come back to it and look at it over and over again. It shows that it was something that was sold on the street and not something that you would necessarily see in a literary salon, if you like. So it's part of its mass there. I think in terms of today's talk, it's quite interesting that you can see it's women working on this wagon, handing it out in the May Day parade in 1935, which becomes a date actually of quite controversy within the magazine, within the gender politics that I'll go back to. So not much has been written about this magazine, as a history, but even less has been written or thought about the women who wrote, sold, read it and ran it and worked on it as a within the kind of business side of it. So this is my attempt really to begin to redress that, and I say that word begin emphatically because I'm hoping with giving talks like this that I will get to think some issues through a bit further. So I'm still at fairly early stages with this part of the project. So I'm going to begin at the ending, if you like. In 1947, just a few months before New Masses magazine would close down, this Communist Arts and Culture and Politics Weekly, a woman called Vivian Howard wrote a satirical feature in that one of the penultimate issues, criticising women's magazines for their unrealistic depiction of women and women's lives. The title of her article was called "Housewives Are Simply Wonderful," and she wrote, "We housewives are being told all the time how wonderful we are," and I like this kind of "we." You'll realise how amusing that is as a statement as we go along. "It makes us feel better while we're washing the diapers. As a matter of fact, we can boast of a whole body of cultural endeavour built around us, about us and for us." And she goes through to kind of mimic the stories and goes over the stories of commonly that she's read in women's magazines about women who have shown kind of extra kind of initiative or whatever to get themselves out of scrapes. So she goes through the narratives of these stories. She concludes, she kind of mocks the unrealistic problems of heroines in magazines such as Ladies' Home Journal, Women's Home Companion, and concludes that they've probably not really helped her to solve the problems that she faces as a housewife. She says, "Although I read my Ladies' Home Journal from page 1 to page 296 every month, cook their recipes, imitate their full-colour pictures when setting my dinner table, and shampoo my hair according to the prescribed steps 1, 2, 3, I would not know what to do if my husband ran away with a blonde or if I discovered a corpse in my motorboat, provided I had a motorboat. I'm afraid I would not even be able to find a sitter for my illegitimate baby while I became a famous dress designer." But she says, anyway, "I'm still proud of these fellow housewives of mine and a little humble before them too." And yet she concludes sarcastically that she's glad she's found these real answers to real problems alongside those splendiferous ads for washing machines, canned soups, linoleum, silverware and refrigerators. So this is 1947. Howard's feature then, it kind of repeats the narrative. It doesn't give an overt political message as you would expect in this magazine at this point. It kind of reiterates this story. It has a kind of sarcastic tone, but you would have to know the context really to pick that up. It contains no accompanying didactic commentary about women's oppression, and its feminist intent then is indicated more by this kind of sarcasm and by its location in this leading communist weekly. And one little insert in the middle, and this is in the middle of some paragraphs, an advert noting that 1948 would mark the 100-year anniversary of the first Women's Rights Convention, and that there was going to be a series by Betty Millard, Women Against Myths, that would appear. So there's no. The point is, I think, that this sort of appears in the middle of this article, but yet the article itself isn't kind of overtly feminist or didactic in that way, or in a Marxist way either. Howard's posturing as this naive reader whose false consciousness is sustained by the capitalist media works paradoxically. So on the one hand, it shows that women on the left were not duped by such fantastical stories and capitalist romances, and yet it also shows a woman paradoxically trapped in middle-class patriarchal values, reading magazines while she works unpaid in a traditional domestic role, if she did, that is, fully aware of her oppression. So the article mocks the generic conventions of women's magazines in post-war America, and yet somewhat blandly repeats the narratives of romance stories for its entertaining material. Whether a ploy to use mass market conventions to interest women in radical politics, or a reflection of the misogyny of the left, then this type of engagement with stereotypical representations of women in mass media and the belief that magazines exploited and commodified women's oppression created a legacy, I think, that I haven't fully traced through, that we might like to talk about in the discussion, through to second wave feminism, that kind of cultural Marxist feminism that you see, particularly or most notably in that employment of a kind of sociological analysis of mass media that you see in Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique, 1963. So what interested me about this article then was that of how close in some ways this kind of feminist thinking was to that burst through of a second wave feminist thought. So Betty Friedan's The Feminine Mystique is probably the most extended analysis of the content and sociological context and kind of psychological import of women's magazines at the time, and a text that teases out the paradoxes of liberal freedom and entrapment highlighted in Howard's article. And in fact, a few years before Howard's article appeared, under the pseudonym of Lillian Stone, Betty Goldstein, who was then her maiden name, I think it was, or some name, Betty Goldstein, who was Friedan, had in fact contributed 2 articles to New Masses on union organising and a strike, in which she prefaces the article, quite interestingly, by mocking the documentary realism of Life magazine journalists who were on the same train as her, going to report the strike in Stamford. That work appeared in the same years as contributions from other left-wing women writers that we will come across, Eve Merriam, Genevieve Taggart, Meridel Lesueur, just to name a few. So it might be tempting then to position this feature and this style of satire in its historical context in the post-war era, and during a kind of the beginnings of this cultural backlash to women's roles in wartime, roles explored by New Masses articles such as What We Have Learned, Women on the Job, 1942, Mothers Gone A-Welding, 1943, and Women in Overalls, 1943 as well. So throughout the 40s, they had explored this new sort of emerging, or women's roles as labour in the wartime industries quite closely. So that's quite an interesting period. So perhaps then this article in 1947 came in the backlash to that. And to be sure, Howard's strategy revives some tried and tested formulas to involve and include working women readers by the left press. As Daniel Horowitz notes, it was not unusual for readers to encounter banal love stories and advice on cosmetics and cooking addressed to women in Communist Party publications throughout the period, so throughout the 1930s. The Communist Party magazine for women in the early 1930s, it was called Working Woman and Woman Today, started the columns Household Corner and Fashion Letter in 1934, which served up fashion, recipe, hair and skin tips, and often with left-wing provisos at the end that these are not dabs of cheer to try and make us content with our lot. Okay, so so they're trying to kind of get the working class female reader in with these techniques, and yet to remind them at the end that there's more to it than this. That actually we're not just trying to cheer you up, and that individual solutions are not solutions at all. So there's a kind of problematic status here of address to the working class female, I think, that is highlighted, that is still continuing throughout the magazine. While women's activism in the 1930s in fact took a variety of stances, including some that we might recognise from second wave feminism, such as adopting mainstream cultural forms to highlight social issues or promote their cause. Oh, okay. Okay, this is a feature in Life magazine, 1938, which shows a communist celebration of Mother Bloor, the union activist, and a communist bathing beauty contest held in the Bronx to honour the lifelong activism of this woman. I mean, talk about contradiction. If we're not confused now, then what will we do? By the late 1940s, however, women readers of communist papers were not just criticising sexism in the mainstream press, but had turned their analysis to the sexism of these kind of cheesecake images printed in the party's newspaper, The Daily Worker, and that was sponsored by the Communist Party, the CPUSA. And it called these, women criticised these and called these a manifestation of male supremacy that should be regarded as seriously as racist stereotyping. So feminist activism then kind of reacted to these images. Howard's article thus serves to highlight the way that left-wing women negotiated a difficult terrain between the popular and the political, the realistic and the idealistic, in their work for New Masses magazine. Eve Merriam's poems a year earlier than in January 1947 certainly adds to this critique and might interestingly be seen as a poem of expressing this comfortable concentration camp imagery that Friedan was later to develop. You can see then, the table is spread with my skin. That's a very kind of evocative image, I think, of that kind of comfortable concentration camp. So this kind of sense there of where Friedan may have been kind of engaging with a broader set of discourses. Likewise, in her poem Monopoly Love Song, Merriam confounds the expectation of a love song by equating marriage or union with a kind of corporate merger, highlighting the romance of capitalism, if you like, or capitalist fantasies of marriage being equated to this kind of conditions of capitalists living under capitalism. So certainly in the 1940s, writers such as Virginia Gardner, Betty Millard, Dorothy Roberts and Eve Merriam saw no contradiction between their Marxism and their analysis of gender oppression. So when I began this project, I had no sort of a priori knowledge of women's contributions to the magazine. And as I mentioned before, the extent and nature of women's contributions was actually unexplored. So all of this was quite unexpected. I was familiar with the arguments, particularly concerning the misogyny of New Masses editors, particularly Michael Gold is seen as the kind of classic kind of celebrator of the proletarian literature in the early 30s, which kind of excluded women. It's the proletarian being defined as this masculine figure of labour. So I was familiar with these kind of arguments that tend to be repeated over and over, that are very problematic actually, that I'm starting to kind of dismantle and question quite closely. And history certainly did focus on the head boys of this movement, to borrow Josephine Herb's criticism of Daniel Aaron's writers on the left. So in the 1960s, as the New Left start to kind of revive or rediscover some of these writers, the women are kind of written out of it. That's generally accepted as true. And Josephine Herbst commented on this. She was a writer for this magazine as well as others, and she said, you know, this is just a focus on the head boys. So this indicates actually that there was more going on than just the head boys. Histories of women in the left have also noted the exclusionary and chauvinistic nature of the left at the time, and women themselves commented on it. A letter from Anne Whedon of New York, published in the 1935 issue of New Masses, is particularly one that they pick up on, particularly feminist kind of rediscoveries of women's roles in this time. Pick up on this letter. I've just got a copy here, I'm not going to read it out. But she accuses New Masses of male supremacy. And this letter has been quite fundamental to kind of like creating this image of New Masses as this quite misogynist magazine. she says that the current issue, July 2nd, of New Masses is written 100% by men, and that 2, the executive positions in the party are all held by men. So that's equating the magazine with the party, which is a problematic thing to do anyway, and I can talk about that a bit more. She adds further down that I would say that the impression one gets is that your recognition of women is even more grudging than that given by capitalism. To match the current New Masses, take Scribner's, in which there are 4 women contributors. And she ends with the challenge: do you feel that women are lacking in ability, or do you admit that you have failed to recognise their ability? So this led to a flurry of letters refuting this, and to explaining that women's issues are. The New Masses was looking at class issues, and that women's issues were part of that, but that a focus on this kind of suffragette figure was not something that they wanted to do. So it causes a flurry of discussion, and a letter that says the party also draws its human material from capitalist society, so therefore it's going to reflect it in some ways as well. So there's a sense here that they're doing the best they can. Partly in response then to this criticism of New Masses, women in it started to kind of contribute their own kind of appreciations of the magazine. Rebecca Pitts in 1936 wrote a confessional-style article called Women and New Masses, and it retold the moment of epiphany that her discovery of New Masses had been for her, and the way that reading it had resulted in a moment of sudden revelation that all the source of all common evils lay in the economic order. So she talks about how she had been educated about her own oppression through reading it. So there's kind of lots of these defences. So Whedon's letter has been picked up by historians to add to this catalogue of examples that show how New Masses was as sexist as the CPUSA. I looked through the issue that Whedon complained about, and I've got the contents just up here, and found she was right. She was definitely right. Even the business manager and the contributing editors were all male. But having spent a lot of time looking through this magazine, I realised this is very unusual. Further investigation showed that part of the reason she was so angry was the fact that this was actually quite uncommon. In fact, I have not found another issue that doesn't have any women in, and I think after her letter it probably shook them up a little bit, and definitely afterwards women's contributions increased. As a reader then, Whedon, the letter writer, may have or would have expected to see contributions from women and didn't, and therefore wrote her letter because she didn't see what she was expecting, as both women as both contributors and as topics, subjects in the magazine. So the absence of women certainly wasn't the case in the earlier years of the publication, and not true of the latter years where I began. And in fact, if you look at the larger picture and the context of Whedon's letter, the letter itself may have done its work, as I could find no other all-male issues. And women's participation in New Masses and in the Communist Party was continuing to grow from 1935. So if they felt excluded, it wasn't expressed in either their contributions to the magazine or their enrolment in the Communist Party. So by looking at the earlier period of the magazine, which ran for 22 years from between 1926 and 48, I found a far more complex picture than has been previously painted by histories of the left or radical women writers. So I found that, in fact, a reader like Whedon would have seen a lot of women actually represented in it. So I could start at the beginning with a few examples. While never dominant in numbers, and I want to stress that actually, women. This isn't a magazine that women were dominant in. I would argue that more women contributed to New Masses than any other similar little magazine in the period. I mean, and that certainly goes for African American contributors too, which is a separate chapter that I've been working on. The list of contributors included groundbreaking female authors and artists, and I'll just go through a few names here. Grace Lumpkin, Myra Page, Meridor Lesieur, Muriel Rukeyser, Genevieve Taggart, Ruth McKenney, Anne Barton, Rebecca Pitt, Ella Winter, Josephine Herbst, Ruth Lecklinter, Dorothy Parker, probably know her, and photographers and artists as well, Margaret Bourke-White, Tina Modotti, and here are some artworks by those women. Tina Modotti's wonderful cover photo used there, and drawings by Wanda Gag. Artists, female artists, Peggy Bacon, Mabel Dwight, and Elizabeth Olds, I'm going to show a few images by them, also contributed. It's a very heavily visual magazine at the time, especially in the early period, and women contributed a lot of that art. So many of the women contributed to New Masses, but aren't known to be New Masses writers, like Margaret Bourke-White, for example. She's known as a Life magazine photographer, or Fortune magazine photographer. And others like Tess Schlesinger, who, while working for New Masses, also worked in wide circulation magazines, such as Scribner's, Vanity Fair and Red Book. So quite often the work that the women contributed in these years was actually unpaid or low paid, or just work that they did politically because they wanted to. So it was a kind of volunteer aspect to it. They still did other kinds of work for these other kinds of magazines that always come under criticism, which I think is quite interesting, that they span both those fields. So Whedon's expectation then that women should be present in the magazine would have come because women had featured strongly from the very first issue in May 1926. And for context, this is just 6 years since women had gained the vote, and 9 since the Russian Revolution. So I think quite an interesting transformational period, and the fact that so many women appeared in the very first issue shows the kind of intention there behind setting it up. But it wasn't kind of a focus on women's issues. For example, a report on the Passaic strike in 1926 by Mary Heaton Vorse. Vorse put women at the very front of labour activism. She describes the strike as listening to radical leader Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, who actually ends up writing in the 1940s for the magazine, actually. She highlights that women were marching or leading the march. So she says, she begins the article, "At their head there was a baby carriage. It was Barbary Miskalowski who headed the victorious procession, and her aunt. And then Elizabeth Kovacs who pushed it, and behind the baby carriage and the boys in their helmets and gas masks and in uniform walked the procession, waving and shouting. Thousands upon thousands strode, headed by the baby." Okay, so if you're thinking that, I just like that imagery, I think, because it shows that the pram is there at the front and that the women are all behind it, and this is a labour strike that is the main feature of that issue. Okay, I've got a lot more examples, but I will just to highlight that. I went through the first few months' issues and found, again, articles, art by people like Cornelia Barnes. I think this one's quite interesting, kind of the beauty shop, you would expect that to be the female customer, sort of role reversal. There's adverts for Margaret Sanger's book or a talk by her. But a very problematic person for the left, I think, in terms of her eugenics. Anyone who's read Pivot of Civilization, it's incredibly racist and classist text, actually. And you can see there they put the advert in for it because it's about birth control, which is, they're pro-birth control. But actually it says, her new book is not a panacea for all the ills of humanity. So don't sort of read this and think that this is the answer. So I think this just highlights this kind of feminist thinking, I think, that is quite interesting, and that there's a fine line being trod all the time between, women's issues and the issues on the left, the class analysis and where those two things overlap. Okay. Many other, I'm just going to show you now a few examples from some woodcuts where in the early period women are very often kind of equated, middle class women are very often equated with the kind of bourgeois, a bourgeois sentimentality. This is pre-Great Depression sort of imagery. So you have a kind of criticism of that kind of type of woman here, represented in stories by seamstresses that were submitted, for example, that question the suffragettes' idea of progress. There's a dialogue that goes on between two women. One woman's brought her tapestry in to be repaired by the seamstress in New York, and she says, why are you a member of this Communist Party? You can't, women have the vote now. We have equality. You don't need to, there's no problem. And she highlights the class analysis through that story. Again, democracy and the suffragette movement then are seen as inadequate ways to deal with women's problems. So, just going to go through some of these issues, and you can see here some examples of where women are represented in these earlier issues, here as leisured as well. This changes, I think, as it goes through a period of time. Now, I haven't done a full content analysis because, there's thousands of issues here to go through. But it should be noted that women continue to feature, just in a kind of straw poll, going through as many copies and issues as I can and looking through many tables of contents. Women continue to feature as proletarians and strikers and strike leaders. Garment strikes were covered, and that, even further when the Depression hit. Ella Ford's We Are Mill People looks at the South, the Gastonia strikes, and other garment strikes that went on throughout the 1930s. Myra Page is On the Picket Line, 1931. Mary de Lesueur's Women on the Bread Lines, 1934. So throughout there's this sense of women kind of participating in the labour movement. And similarly, as they travelled as journalists in unprecedented numbers to Soviet Russia, China, Agnes Smedley famously sent reports back from China, Mexico, Cuba and Spain, women reported back in elegant moving reportage from war zones. Women on politics reported on politics, foreign policy, war, labour disputes. So if you go through and look for women, right, you have to find them by either their name, not by the content of what they were writing about, because these are kind of their articles, sometimes written in a male voice, sometimes from a male perspective, or sometimes just on a political issue. So they're not kind of looking at things through a kind of gender prism, which quite often I think we start to look for when we start to look for gender in a magazine. And you can see art as well representing that. So Elizabeth Old's art, New Women of Spain, from the Spanish Civil War, showing women with guns and their faces there. So political events were covered then by women irrespective of gender. Rukeyser wrote on Scottsboro, and did other artists and poets wrote on it too. Herbst on Cuba, and the South always featured heavily in the magazine, often covered by women in the South. So the kind of feminists and social reformers then, why you might think some of this is misogynist or anti-feminist, might be some of the articles that the women actually produced themselves. Grace Lumpkin, for example, on her one of her articles, admonished young feminists for assuming that the combination of work and motherhood was new, and also highlighting the fact that emancipated womanhood rests on the back of exploited girls and women, as I think it still does today. Such women continue to highlight the double burden and responsibilities of working class women. So bourgeois wives and middle class women, including those feminists and women's rights activists, were often mocked and criticised and lampooned in cartoons as well as articles. You see here Miss Manchester's musical programme for homeless men, so a kind of reformer there playing her harp to the homeless men, so they kind of lampooned these kind of do-gooders. A kind of interesting class analysis were made. A poem by Tilly Lerner, who became Tilly Olsen, was inspired by a letter written in New Masses in 1934, And she writes, "I want you women up north to know how those dainty children's dresses you buy at Macy's, Wanamaker's, Gimbel's, Marshall Field's are dyed in blood, are stitched in wasting flesh down in San Antonio." Okay, so they're kind of directly relating women's freedom to buy or purchase, or the kind of bourgeois middle class women's freedoms with with the oppression, with class oppression. Black women's issues as well, with the image that I started off with, were covered. I mean, not in huge numbers, but I think this 1940 article is very interesting, written by a female domestic to kind of highlight the grueling nature of her work and the way that it becomes, the way in the South her work is seen as or constricted by the idea of labour and unpaid domestic work. Black women workers, for example, laid off in the war as well, featured strongly. So what's interesting about many of these reports is the way that women could write with multiple voices, in multiple registers, male and female, in a kind of populist magazine style, or in a kind of quite a Marxist critique or a report from Washington. So I think there's a number of registers going on here. So it's not easy to kind of summarise and encapsulate. And reportage, for example, would enable women to kind of fictionalise the real, if you like. So in the same issue then that Whedon makes her complaint about, or the same year, in 1935, the first proletarian novel contest was actually won by a woman called Clara Weatherwax for her Marching. Admittedly, she did submit it under a male pseudonym, so whether that had any effect, we don't know. But it's interesting that the first proletarian novel prize gets awarded to a female writer. So I think some of these things, we start to question this idea about the kind of misogyny of the left and its exclusory nature, and then the way then women broke off to start the second wave feminism, which I think this is a simplified, encapsulated narrative of what happens. Okay, so I think I will summarise now to conclude. So at the same time then, there's a lot of problems trying to piece together this type of history of the left, particularly when it comes to the Cold War, when people write under pseudonyms, they change their names and addresses, and then they disappear. So it's quite difficult to kind of piece things together. But I think it's interesting to think about the way new masses tried to solicit new work from the working class, and that included women as well. New Masses published regular correspondence and feedback from its readership as well, and some of those letters are from women, so we have to think of that voice being included too. Women also worked in other roles that I think deserve attention, as fundraisers, activists, as managers, entertainment organisers, reviewers, and a number of other different groundbreaking kind of roles. To conclude, women used new masses then to exercise a new voice and experiment with their ideas, fictional and non-fictional, short stories and poems, later gathered into longer works and anthologies, which have been preserved, from writers like Lucchese, Smedley and Le Sueur, for example. But they started to experiment in ways that have not been fully treated. Now, this doesn't mean that all their contributions were feminist, or as such, or represented a woman's position. And in fact, the article that I began with was not really typical of the magazine. Women who wrote for New Masses were hardly ever confined to discussing women's problems at all. In fact, the official Communist Party position was that there were no women's issues, that everything was a class issue. It meant that women wrote on a vast range of political, social and artistic themes, particularly wars, strikes, labour, politics and foreign policy. So paradoxically then, the fact that the woman question tended to get ignored might suggest to us something other than a simple misogyny of the left or the New Masses crowd. It might tell us that the women who contributed to New Masses had used the space to be freed from the constraints of conventional or traditional gendered subject matter and explore political and social transformation and liberation through their work for the magazine. So in the 1940s, these may have blended traditional women's magazine column styles or in a light-hearted tone or other types of literary devices. The one thing I've never come across in New Masses is a recipe or an advert for makeup or any advice to housewives other than to read Marx and Engels, organise a union and get on the picket line. So I'm ending with the image here of Naomi Ward's I Am Domestic, because I think it, in representations of female experience of work and politics in New Masses, shows that there's a kind of equation here with domestic work with labour. So I think they've worked hard to establish that this is not a separate women's issue. And hopefully, and it's not just the comfortable concentration camp that women opted for in the 1950s. I think there's more going on here. So New Masses, I hope I've shown, had a long history of such contributions that women made to left-wing politics, literature and aesthetics during the period, and I think there's many, many more things to discuss. So thank you for that.
Came in late. I'm Christopher Phelps in the American Studies program here, and I've been asked to interact a bit with Dr. Currell, and that's a prelude to you all asking your own questions. So I hope you do have them and feel very welcome to take part in this discussion. But we'll just chat for about 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up. Like you, I've just heard this for the first time. Wonderful talk. I'm persuaded that the idea that the old left was simply misogynistic and exclusive, didn't have meaningful and significant roles for women, is inaccurate. And I think this kind of reclamation is interesting and ongoing. I might tip in a slightly more critical direction on the entire project of the New Masses than you would in terms of my own personal proclivities, and some of my questions might test you a bit in that respect. One thing, this is a kind of tip for the undergraduates in our program especially, if you haven't seen the movie Reds, which stars Warren Beatty, and it's just fantastic as a movie. It's 3 hours long, it's an epic, but it came out in 1981, I believe. But that movie, Reds, is about an earlier Masses, because the New Masses is named the New Masses in 1926 because the old Masses, which was circa 1912, 1917, I might have the date slightly wrong there, but it was wrecked on the shoals of the First World War because it was opposed to American intervention in the First World War as an imperialist war. And had Max Eastman and John Reed involved, Louise Bryant, who was John Reed's paramour, Emma Goldman, very kind of anarchistic, revolutionary, Greenwich Village, bohemian left. And often the Masses is contrasted with the New Masses. And I wanted to ask you, start by just asking you a bit of a sort of aesthetic question, which is, you could think of the left's criticism of capitalism in two strains. I'm being kind of general here, but I've been thinking about this a lot, and I tend to think there's an old bohemian intellectual, cultural criticism of capitalism. Capitalism as Puritanism, capitalism as stultification, capitalism as mass culture, and capitalism as kind of banality in the name of personal liberation, which the old Masses is very much identified with. Sexual freedom, birth control, Margaret Sanger wrote for it too. The New Masses, I think of as perhaps more in line with the social criticism of capitalism as exploitation, as class oppression. And this is what people say, although it is very much a literary, cultural, artistic niche that it's filling in the communist left of the 30s and 40s, people think of it as being more didactic, more about a kind of social politics and message. And what what do you make of that? What do you see the women artists of the new masses doing? And do you think that that's an unfair rap? I think you do. But then let me turn the tables a bit and ask you, why is it that the new masses has this reputation?
Okay, I don't think it's unfair rap, actually. I think it's quite accurate.
Okay.
So I'm not sure, maybe we don't disagree. I think, I mean, you know, what happens, what happens to it? It follows a Stalinist line, and you know that very much goes out of favour by 1948. But even before that, within the left, there's a lot of fragmentation within the left. So Partisan Review, which is a good example of the type of magazine that kind of becomes an opposing kind of arts and culture magazine, and it's one that lots of people have written about. Actually began from New Masses. They decided that New Masses wasn't publishing enough kind of high art poetry, so they set up Partisan Review. The same people that worked for New Masses ended up working for Partisan Review, but then quickly they went basically the Partisan Review people went Trotskyist, and New Masses went Stalinist, and these, you can imagine, these two sides were at loggerheads. But if you look at Partisan Review, I mean, I'm just looking at aesthetically, and what interests me is that so many people have written about Partisan Review and revere it and look at it, and yet it has very few women writers in it. It has no pictures. It's the most dull-looking magazine that you can imagine, and actually coming at this with trying to see it without the Stalinist Trotskyist kind of divide, you know, made me come to this and think, wow, this is really exciting and interesting visually. Its layout, its typographical stuff, but its artistic aims and ambitions. And actually, it's not, you know, it's often called the Communist Party's mouthpiece and things like that. Well, I think it was communist, and it definitely kept a Stalinist line, although it had lots of debates within it. It's not clearly, you can't clearly summarise it that, because it has such a changing set of editors all the time. It has so many different voices, and the other thing that's problematic about it is that obviously the Communist Party line changes all the time, and you can see them within the editorials trying to kind of make that shift and explain away what they said last week. You know, they're trying really hard to keep up with the Comintern directives, but they're not actually doing that. And to me, I felt that you could read between the lines and see beyond this kind of idea that it was just a Stalinist mouthpiece and just bland. That actually, I think it's, you know, and for one thing, it has a lot of fantastic poetry published by very avant-garde writers, very experimental. And Langston Hughes's Waldorf Astoria poem, for example, haven't got it on this, but it's part of a double-page spread. He first publishes it there in New Masses. So this kind of modernist experimentalist art is still going on at the same time that you get doggerel and really terrible workers' poetry, or, you know, it's not because they're workers, it's just bad poetry. You know, so it's a very mixed bag. It's almost impossible to summarise in that way. And I think it was very, very, it became part of a very kind of like a strong attack on the left, particularly the Stalinist left, from 1939 onwards. HUAC was after it, and I've done some investigations into FBI files and to HUAC reports, and I've tracked how often New Masses gets mentioned. Partisan Review doesn't, right? But New Masses does, and it becomes almost a badge of your guilt, of your communist guilt. And I think people burnt their copies, they burnt the records, and then obviously with the Nazi-Soviet pact, they burnt their membership cards. You know, so you have a changing history in the post-war period, which really has influenced how we look at it. I'm trying to do something where we go back and look at it at the time, in the context of the time. You know, it's impossible to do. It's an impossible task. But
so, this is a bit of a scholarly question that takes off directly from what you just said. But it seems to me that there are interesting scholarly literatures on this question now. And I was thinking, I believe you're trained in literature, yes? And I'm trained in history. And one of the beautiful things about American studies at this university, and in general, I'm sure as the head of American Studies in Britain, you deeply appreciate that it's a chance for historians and literary scholars and cultural studies people to all interact and recognize that it's all part of a whole, which you don't get when you're in isolated departmental lives. So this question is a little bit about divergent literatures, because it seems to me that historians and literary scholars are thinking differently about the Communist Party and its role in American life now. And that historians, especially political historians and diplomatic historians, have basically concluded that the Rosenbergs did do atomic espionage, that Hiss was involved in Soviet espionage at Yalta, that the Communist Party, in fact, did, for the most part, hold responsibility for running a covert Soviet espionage operation, and that the Communist Party really was an instrument of the Soviet Union. And that, as you're saying, all associated publications, even as obscure as the New Masses to what's going on in Moscow, are forced to correspond to the line. Literary scholars, on the other hand, Michael Denning's The Laboring of America and so forth, all of a sudden it's a great appreciation of the Communist Party and its role in American cultural life. Now, there are labor historians, women's historians, social historians, who in fact are doing the same kind of thing you're doing. So I don't think it's just a history-literature divide, but it does seem like there are these sort of subfields, which as American studies scholars we should be trying to break down, that are on different tracks about the Communist Party, and particularly how to evaluate its merit and how to evaluate its, autonomy. Its autonomy. You seem to be tipping toward the autonomy. You're saying it's messy. It's, what do we do with that?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really important question, really interesting. And I see myself more as a cultural historian than a literary historian, I suppose. So, kind of the overlap. Yeah, I appreciate the overlap. I think, okay, I'm trying not to collapse the magazine with the Communist Party. Now that's quite difficult to do because a lot of the people that worked for it were communists. Many you don't know if they were or not. They had their office actually where the Communist Party, the CPUSA, had the office a few floors up, so they could pop up and, so there was close interaction. But there has never been any evidence, and this is what's been presumed, that there was any kind of financial support from the Communist Party. And I think they were very, very clear to keep themselves autonomous. That from the start they claim, this is going to be an autonomous, this is a magazine, this is not a, they had the Daily Worker. Mike Gold was writing for the Daily Worker all the time he was working on New Masses. He had his mouthpiece, he didn't need this magazine. This magazine was had a different kind of agenda. So I think it's important to see it as, to try and disentangle that a little bit and see it as a cultural phenomenon that comes out of communist thinking, but doesn't necessarily follow any kind of particular line, I suppose. It's kind of always, it's quite experimental, it's quite looking to try different things. It's,
Let me, if it's okay, you can just pause there. I have two more clusters and then I'm opening it up and you all have to ask some questions, so get ready. The first is about margin and mainstream, radicalism in America. I've been thinking about Pete Seeger. I don't know if you all saw the news yesterday that Pete Seeger has died at age 94. It seems like he lived forever. But Pete Seeger had his start in the popular front left that she described. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me if some of his songs had been published in the New Masses. I don't know if that's true, but the Almanac Singers and Woody Guthrie back then. I've been thinking about Woody Guthrie. Union Maids is a great women's labor movement song, which I won't sing.
Oh, go on.
Only if the students demand it.
We can put the words up and everyone sings.
Union Maids was written by Woody Guthrie, who of course wrote This Land Is Your Land, which is, people think is the national anthem now. And he wrote This Land Is Your Land when he was in the Communist Party, Woody Guthrie. And Pete Seeger was in the Communist Party. Pete Seeger wrote If I Had a Hammer and Where Have All the Flowers Gone, and all these folk songs that you just think have been around since the 19th century or something. Those are two people who, margin and mainstream, were a dialectic rather than polarities, if you understand. That is, they had their political commitments, they were radical to the core, and yet they became America. To what extent do you think the new masses did, or not?
Became America?
Could. I mean, was it on the margins, or did it have influence? I mean, who read it? Did it get beyond the Communist Party circles? In a way that
absolutely. I mean, just that image that I showed at the beginning, if you see the Mayday truck, okay, there's people in Mayday, but just it certainly went beyond those, you know, party members, and, you know, it was international. It crossed, you know, a lot of nations' borders. It was sold quite widely in the South, interestingly enough, and they really did focus a lot on South issues. And I can't remember the name of the person working on it, but I think it might be James Smethurst who comments on the extent to which the magazine actually was interested in a kind of proto-civil rights movement. In actual fact, things like Scottsboro, they reported and were very critical of, and actually New Masses actually sponsored the lawyers who went in to work for them. So, and there was almost a kind of battle for who could, between them and the NAACP, on who's representing. You know, there's a kind of battle with the NAACP for the kind of hearts and minds of the African Americans at the time. So that's slightly gone off. So I'm not sure how that relates to the mainstream, but I think Popular Front era. I mean, clearly there's an attempt to address the middle classes. Stop being these kinds of figures of just ridiculous bourgeois upper class people, and there starts to be an address to the issues that concern the white collar workers, for example, you know, that kind of thing. So there's a definite shift during the Popular Front era towards a kind of more mainstream address. But they're always interested in mainstream media too, so there's always a criticism of that going on. Hearst always comes under strong criticism, and the kind of control of the mainstream media is always critiqued. But then things like Chaplin films, the latest kind of popular culture film, might also be, they're attempting a very kind of early kind of Marxist criticism of those types of forms too. So there's a real kind of moving between mainstream and kind of margins really all the time. Jazz is a really good example actually of where they try to bridge both. You know, they become very interested in jazz, do a lot of jazz reviewing, put on a lot of jazz concerts and shows. They put one on, the famous one in Carnegie Hall that gets cited in every jazz history. That was a New Masses benefit, or it's one that they sponsored.
Concert, okay.
Yeah.
So last cluster, gender in the left and the legacy. And this gets at your repeat allusions to Betty Friedan. But here's a case of where there's been a substantial revision, because when the women's liberation movement was born in the 1960s, nobody knew that Betty Friedan had been part of the old left at the time. She positioned herself as a middle-class housewife, and it's often a book that's criticized for having almost no class or race in it. And furthermore, the young women who were in the women's liberation movement proper, 1967, 68, 69, were often red diaper babies. And just as there's a generational thing going on, new left, old left, there's a women's liberation versus the old left thing going on. And the early scholarship on all the old left is that they were deeply deficient about gender. And I'm not sure you're not setting up a straw woman or something like that to knock down with the idea that they were just misogynist and exclusive, because I thought the argument that was really at stake was that the old left thought of gender as an economically caused illusion, essentially, that they were economic determinists. So the answer for women's problems was to enter the workforce, to form unions, to fight against wage discrimination, and Soviet womanhood. You know, the communist future will solve this problem for us. It's in camaraderie and solidarity with male workers. It's in the class that we will find our liberation. And that seems to me a more powerful criticism of the gender politics of the new masses and its ilk than the one that you were going after, which I think is vulgar and wrong. But I wonder to what extent you think that's true that they did. For instance, you know, I'm adopting implausibly enough the voice of a women's liberation activist of 1969, and I believe she'd say, what did they say about abortion? What did they say about rape? What did they say about child sexual abuse? What did they say about battery? What did they say about domestic violence and men and women's relationship in the household? Did they talk about sharing housework? Did they talk about real equality? The personal is political. The old left missed this. They never thought of the personal as political. They thought the social is political. We got to get you into the workforce and make you equal there. What do you think?
Well, I don't know, because I thought that too. I thought that that's the general way the general arguments go, but I didn't have a chance to kind of go through that. But there are body politics is addressed in some of these articles, particularly unwanted pregnancy and motherhood, young motherhood. There's quite a lot of attention on equating the prostitution of young women with poor young women, you know, who have to kind of sell their bodies, especially in the 1930s, with capitalist exploitation. So there is a kind of interest in body politics, actually, even coming from Mike Gold himself. Actually, there's some articles that I didn't have time to go into, and not so much domestic abuse, because I think to paint the worker, the male worker, in that way probably would have been a step too far, maybe. But on the other hand, you know, housework and that kind of thing, and women having the double role, the sorts of things that are addressed in the second wave do appear. Birth control being another one. I mean, I was kind of interested when the Communist Party, when Stalin changes his policy, so from the revolution, abortion is free and legal and easily available, up until 1936, when Stalin then makes it illegal. So I'm kind of interested in looking at some issues around that to see what kind of comments, how the women shift. Do they kind of stick with the Stalin line, or do they? And I haven't had time to go into that kind of detail. But I think it's a little bit more subtle than perhaps, yeah, there are those issues. And in their short stories, I think some of the women do write about these things as well. So I want to spend more time, you know, to answer that better.
Well, thank you for participating in that with me. So that was a go, and now we have you. You know, so surely you've got some questions out there for our guests, and if you'd like to ask them, please have at it. Anybody want it? Yes, please.
Do you have any insight into how the editors were chosen and placed, and how democratic a process that was, or whether it was a sort of old boys network, and whether a woman was ever on the editorial board?
Yeah, there were lots of women on the editorial board, but the editorial board didn't always necessarily reflect the power dynamics. You know, contributing editors, there's a long list of those with lots of women's names. As in main editors, it did kind of revolve around. So I'm kind of looking at what records there are from those editors to try and kind of like look at their letters and how they addressed things. But there was a lot of confusion about editors, and I haven't found, I think one of the problems, when I set out to do this project, I kind of thought, oh, I can't, you know, one of the first things I'll do is look for that archive of all the editorial meetings and board meetings so that I can then create this history. And of course, that doesn't, as far as I can find out, after 2 or 3 years of trying to find it, that there isn't that archive. There are little hints here and there of discussions or reports. And I would say, yeah, the majority of the head boys, yes, were men. But yeah, I need to. That's a good question that I need to kind of like look at more. There's no main editor who is female, so that is, yeah.
Kim.
This is really interesting. I just have one sort of very specific question. And that is, okay, this went till 1948. Women in the factories win the war. That's the CP line, right? No strikes or anything like that. What was their attitude when the war ended and women were being pushed out of these jobs to make room for returning GIs and so forth? Did they mount any defense of the...
Yeah, absolutely did. Yeah. Yeah, they mounted defence against that, and you know, which is, I think, where, because by that time there were a lot more female contributors and editors and managers at that point as well. So it was an issue that was addressed. And equal wages, all of those issues. So wartime work itself being criticised for not paying the same rate and things like that, but also, and the unions are also criticised. And then post-war, I think that's partly where this is coming from. I think also New Masses mounted probably the most vocal anti-HUAC protests that there were at that time. It's quite interesting. They were very public about the fact that HUAC were after them and had this kind of very kind of public spat. So it's quite interesting for both of those reasons. Yeah.
You were saying that a lot of the articles that are written by women were not necessarily about housework or whatever you might expect, but about political ideas and things like that. But you then said that actually some of them also still published it under male pseudonyms.
Yeah.
How typical then would an article like that be, even within maybe a communist box, if you like?
An article like
in the kind of political context rather than in a housewife context. I mean, kind of, even if I was maybe a communist reader, would it be likely that I would take an article with that kind of spin seriously if it was written by a woman? Does that make sense?
Oh, okay. Yes, no, I think so. I mean, the majority of articles were not about the domestic or about housewives, or they would be about either the type of work that women did or a kind of representation, fictional or poetic sort of analysis that may have a female at the centre, but it wasn't necessarily sort of seen as the reason to write it because women are oppressed. It's because a worker is oppressed, if you see what I mean. So the majority of articles would have been not written with a particular gender kind of in mind, and you see that as well. You have poets, male poets and artists, which is another thing that I didn't have time to go into, who also kind of project female voice or character as well sometimes. So that's quite interesting too.
I've got Dan, and then I'll get you last. Is that right?
Are you in your introduction, Christopher, there, you're quite keen to point out that the Communist Party does not pay.
Yeah.
Who did?
Yeah.
Who advertises in it, and are they kind of consistent big donors?
Yeah, no, they've always had a financial crisis, which is partly what why it's difficult to trace, because they're almost always shutting down. There's so many fundraising drives all the time. In some ways, it has a kind of paradoxical kind of energy, adds a paradoxical energy to each issue. I mean, the editorial letters that I have found and kind of archival stuff that I have looked at, there's always this constant sense of like, how are we going to fund the next issue? So they're always fundraising through membership sort of appeals and that kind of thing. But they run, in New York, they run a huge amount of fundraising activities, plays, dramas. So you have artists, a dance choreographer like Martha Graham, for example, who does a lot of, puts on a lot of shows that then the money goes to sponsor the magazine. So a lot of the artists who contributed or who were reviewed in it from the left would also kind of offer, some kind of support. So they were always on, literally kind of right up to the line in terms of money. And then they would have fundraisers. They had art auctions, so some of the art that actually you would see in there would then be part of the fundraiser. So they would have auctions of that art. they had lots and lots of parties, like balls, spring ball, New Year's ball, various anything in the middle of, the year ball, which would invite everybody, and it would be, one of the things would be, come and meet your editors. So the editors would be part of the entertainment, so that you could actually, go and meet them. It would also be a space in which Communist Party membership could be, people could be signed up for it. So it was a propaganda thing as well, but it was also a space by which people would have these kind of parties. It was lampooned by the late 30s, the idea of all these communists, having fancy dress balls and parties all the time, to raise money. It was lampooned in various kind of media outlets. But yeah, they always needed money, and they fundraised like hell the whole time. And it kind of led to an interesting cultural phenomenon, I think, of all of these activities going on, in which, where I've argued elsewhere that the magazine is more than the magazine on print. It's actually a whole network of culture, even kind of filtering in the late 30s into Hollywood, and getting sponsorship from Hollywood directors. In fact, the manager moved in about 1937. The activities manager moved from New York to California to do fundraising there, and actually she was closely associated with what became the Hollywood 10. So there's an interesting thing of the new masses even moving into there. So it's a network of various activities as much as just the magazine itself. In some ways the magazine is just a kind of sideline almost to these other activities.
Alice.
Michelle.
Oh, Michelle. I thought you were Alice Lily. Sorry. I don't know where Alice Lily is. Right here. Sorry. Michelle, I apologize. Alice, I apologize.
Thank you for your talk. It's very interesting. I was just actually to spring off that last question. If you don't really, the way you're judging gender is by names, but also the names are quite unreliable because women publish under male pseudonyms. And the fact that they're always constantly on the edge of a financial crisis, and will they be around next week, next month, whatever. Did they always have quite a steady run of writers, or is there a chance, like I'm just thinking like in the case of George Eliot, she kept her publishing going for ages. She was just writing everything under the same name. Yeah. And I'm just wondering, could some of these people, be the same authors but just under a different name, and therefore what kind of implication would that have on your gender analysis?
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but yes, I mean, writers did write under different names, or male writers did as well. Arthur Miller wrote under the name of something Wayne. It's got Wayne in it, but I can't remember. But he cut his teeth on writing for it as well. So under different names. So yeah, it's a tricky one, and I think the only thing I can do really is I can't really answer it, but I think if I can highlight some awareness of it, that in some ways that's something that will never be resolved necessarily. But writers sometimes got paid for things and sometimes didn't, so I'd be surprised if people were that keen to keep sending their, unless they were getting paid obviously for it. There's a lot of letters that I've found that are addressed to, like Muriel Rickaser and writers like that. I went to her archive and looked through letters that had been sent to her from editors, are pleading for more poems, asking more poems, and then contrary, like kind of sending them back saying they're not Marxist enough or something. They're not, so you had to deal with a bunch of difficult people, I think. So yeah, but yeah, they were always on the lookout for more material.
Way in the far back.
You said some stuff about how women were representative, relatively quantitatively within it, so it doesn't want to put no women in there, but mostly. But how were they represented equally qualitatively? So if a woman wrote something, was it like given the same prominence as a man writing a equivalent thing?
Yeah. No, I think that is something, that's an interesting question. I think that's very, very well put. If you look at reviews, that's quite interesting. Reviews of women's stories or poetry or things like that, were sometimes, and sometimes they would put an article in with male or female, it might not be, it doesn't necessarily not related to gender, but then the editors would then put a little note underneath saying, we don't agree with this. They published it, but they published a lot of things that they didn't necessarily agree with, just to see what would happen. And they would sometimes put disclaimers, you know, this is not the opinion of the editors, but that actually they'd put a long set of reasons why they don't agree with it. And I think, I think sometimes that was quite gendered, that approach, that analysis was.
I'm going to go to Lottie and then you.
Yeah, and just back to the subject of finances. Do you know whether women were paid equally to men for their contributions to the magazine, or was there a difference between how they were paid?
Yeah, no, I think it's very hard to find like payments, but yes, that was equal. There was a point when I found a contract that they'd signed, and I can't remember what union it is, but there were strict regulations on who was paid for how much, and that was not gendered. But obviously, there might be a preference into how many articles you accept by a man or something. But, yeah.
You, my friend.
Yes. I was just wondering, I'm not familiar with the New Masses itself, but I have read The Girl, and I understand that the largest section of that published in New Masses, and in fact, she's very critical of how the party is run by men. I was wondering, is there a dialogue that feeds out that, with people responding to Lister's criticisms, or is it very much something that's published in isolation?
Is there a dialogue within the magazine?
Yeah.
Yeah, there's very much a dialogue within the magazine, and I think that's what makes it quite hard to summarise in a simplistic way, which is kind of my argument in the sense that it has been kind of treated as this kind of one unified simplistic thing, and in actual fact it's very dialogic, to the point where even two editors out of this whole cooperative group of editors might be disagreeing with each other. Letters might be disagreeing with things from the week before, and then articles within it not necessarily having the same line of argument. So I think what I like about it, and what I think kind of counteracts this Stalinist view of this kind of mouthpiece, propaganda mouthpiece, is that it did have so many, it did kind of open itself up to a lot of different criticisms and arguments, and managed to kind of express those within it in quite a dialogic way, which I think is quite unique, or at least not something that I'm familiar with in other magazines, and not today either. How there's a kind of self-analysis here, which I think kind of goes along with this kind of sort of Marxist, sort of self-examination that seems to be a kind of constant thing that they do publicly in the magazine. To the point, but not to the point where they would get thrown out of the party or something terrible happened to them. So.
Okay, this has been great. We've got 2 questions up front. I'm going to leave open for 2 questions further to the back, and then we're going to call it quits before anybody gets too tired. Tom?
Yeah, I really like this idea of this network of culture. And going back to one of the first images you showed of them trying to distribute it, do you have any information about what that was actually like? You get this image of this kind of hustle and bustle, and you've got these women handing the paper out to people. Do you have any information about how it circulated, apart from the annual subscriptions, but at these kind of mass protest events, such as the May Day riots, and kind of the interactions they would have had? Were there any records from the people who were kind of on the, not people who were writing it, but people who were handing it out?
Yeah, it wasn't, that was probably quite unusual to be actually in the streets handing it out. It would have been sold in left-wing bookshops, and it would have been sold by subscription, and it was sold all over the US, and outside of the US too. And then each state had its own kind of, nodal point, I suppose, or party, or bookshop or left-wing bookshop, particularly say on the West Coast. And in its early period, it kind of the offshoots were John Reed clubs that New Masses set up. These John Reed clubs, which were to encourage worker writers to send contributions in. So that would be connected to reading the magazine, I think, as well as contributing. The idea that anyone could contribute was very much part of it. So, yeah, circulation, I think, is easier to establish in some respects from. Thankfully, the McCarthy trials have done a lot of saved me a lot of time in the fact that they preserved a lot of as much information about, you know, that I probably wouldn't be able to trace, about where it was sold, who bought it, and that kind of thing. I've actually used that more to try and piece together these kinds of questions than I ever thought I would, actually. But yeah, it's like if a bookshop is there stocking it, and you know, it would be one of the first to be closed down, for example.
We'll take a capacious sense of the back. Anybody beyond the second row who wants to ask a question at this point? Going once, going twice. Lorenzo, you're going to ask the last question, apparently.
Okay. Which has partially been already answered, so it's going to be very short, because my question was about geographical distribution.
Okay.
And you partially said that. The other part of the question was, in dealing with gender, do the articles to some extent consider the difference between the different areas of the United States? So there is a kind of trying to tackling the different, it's more about the South maybe.
Yeah.
But I don't know, is there to some extent this?
Yeah, that's interesting, because someone said to me, "Oh, is it just New York? You know, it's just focused on New York." But actually, it's not at all just focused on New York. Obviously, it reviews things going on in New York and has adverts from various kinds of cafes and things like that in New York. But it's much more. It attempts to kind of reach out across borders quite a lot, and actually, although focusing on the specific issue that might be experienced in that area. It was very much about kind of reaching across borders and creating kind of commonalities. A good example would be Mexico, for example. Lots of reports came from Mexico. There was a lot of translation of Chinese and Mexican poets as well as Russian. Sometimes, you know, so it was a kind of conduit for a kind of much more kind of an international kind of communist kind of arts and culture kind of dissemination, I think. So, yeah, they didn't really they would have reports, like, for example, reports from Washington or reports from California or reports from Chicago, a particular thing. But they didn't particularly focus on one area.
Okay, thank you all very, very much for coming. Apologies again about the wall. We didn't see that one coming. Why is it cozy than we intended? But next time, I'll put it down. I'll put it down again.
Kevin, can I just let everyone know that I've actually got a few copies down here, because normally when I give a talk like this, there's only about 11 people, so I thought I'd pass it round. But I haven't done that. But if you do want to have a look, there's some at the front here, so do come and have a flick through if you want to. Sorry.